Hi, I'm Maddie, and this is my persuasive speech. Imagine you're a doctor. The year is 1918. As you pass by bed after bed of dying soldiers, you desperately think to yourself, what evil has befallen us? You have a poultice pressed to your nose and mouth to protect yourself from being infected, but more to cover the stench of death. This proves ineffective as the dead are everywhere. The spread of influenza is swift and final. The death toll staggers, and scarier still, officials are generally unaware that the flu is viral, or how it is spread. You hear some states imposing quarantines, and other people have been advised to stay indoors. The world as you know it begins to wither away as schools close, telephone services collapse, garbage remains in the street, workers become ill, and businesses close their doors. Now imagine telling this doctor that there's a vaccine that millions of people annually receive in this century that could have prevented the death of roughly 675,000 Americans, not to mention the 25% of the world's population that have been affected. Then imagine telling this doctor that in the year 2018, there are people fighting to have their children exempt from vaccinations. The world is a strange place, they might think. The history of vaccines doesn't really begin with a vaccine, does it? It begins with the long history of infectious disease. It begins with colonization, population growth, industrialization, and scientific process. As early as 1776, Edward Jenner began his experiments with the smallpox virus that further developed over the next 200 years and led to the eradication of smallpox. Louis Pasteur's rabies vaccine next swept the nation, and by the 1930s, we had vaccines to protect against tuberculosis, rubella, rabies, smallpox, measles, mumps, and polio. In considering the history of vaccines, it becomes evident where the seed of doubt planted itself and began to grow. Vaccines are made up of what they fight against, and therein lies the moral and philosophical debate surrounding vaccinating children and causing many to opt out of vaccination. However, many of these arguments are highly misleading. Vaccination is a hotly debated issue, but I have chosen to highlight the 3 myths that I find to be the most damaging. The first myth is that vaccines cause autism. This simply isn't true. Not only is there no scientifically proven theory as to what causes autism, the scientific study released in 1997 that linked autism in British children to the MMR vaccine, which is measles, mumps, and rubella, was debunked as junk science. Current research has led scientists to believe that autism develops in utero, therefore proving vaccines given during early childhood could not cause autism. The second myth is that infant immune systems are weak. In fact, babies are exposed to countless bacteria and viruses every day, and immunization exposure pales in comparison. Based on the number of antibodies present in the blood, a baby would theoretically have the ability to respond to around 10,000 vaccines at one time. Even if all 14 scheduled vaccines were given at once, it would only use up slightly more than 0.1% of a baby's immune capacity. There will always be a percentage of the population that reacts differently to certain medical procedures. However, we must acknowledge that oftentimes, when one opts out of having their healthy child vaccinated, they are putting children who are not healthy at risk. Many parents who opt out of vaccinating their children believe that it is more important to develop a natural immunity to infectious diseases. However, there is only a 1 in 1,000,000% chance of death from exposure to the MMR vaccine, and a 1 in 500 chance of death from exposure to measles as a child. The third myth is that the CDC and pharmaceutical companies are in cahoots against the general population. In other words, there is some kind of conspiracy theory at work here. And the great thing about conspiracy theories is that they can't technically be disproved. However, the reality is that pharmaceutical companies make the most money from their blockbuster drugs. Vaccines, while obviously successful, are not the predominant moneymakers. The other side of this coin is that many industries in the U.S. are successful, and in a capitalist country, the goal of industry is measured in money. So while the pharmaceutical companies are by no means innocent, they aren't grossly profiting from vaccinating your children. The CDC also doesn't have anything against your children. And in fact, there are many countries besides the U.S. that require children to receive vaccinations before enrolling in school, such as France, the the UK, Japan, China, and Australia. The CDC is not unique in its requirements for immunizing children, and in fact, many states have much less punitive options for people who opt out of immunizing their children. In conclusion, when considering how widespread and vulnerable people were to infectious disease in the early 20th century, it is evident how necessary vaccines are for our current population. There are many arguments against vaccines are easily debunked by common sense and science. Surprisingly, King and Pierce counties are two of the most densely populated areas that have the highest rate of currently enrolled students who are exempt from immunization. And somewhat unsurprisingly, the Seattle Times reported that since the 1990s has fueled a threefold increase in measles, up to 308 cases last year, when measles hit 12 people in King County in 2001. None of the victims had been fully immunized. And declining immunizations may be contributing to the state's resurgence of whooping cough cases, 356 through July, up from 291 for the same period last year. Vaccinations are the key to unlocking a healthy life for your child. Thank you.